Hi, and welcome to the session called Using SQL Executor to Directly Run Dynamic SQL Statements. Here we have a little disclaimer about the session. In this session, we will see what SQL Executor is, how to perform CRUD operations like SQL create, SQL retrieve, SQL update, or SQL delete, how to use store procedures, and transactions with SQL Executor. Now, here's a little background info about myself and some info about my company. SQL Executor is a .NET object that can directly run dynamic SQL statements. It can perform SQL Builder functions. It can do model queries, and it is part of the SnapObject's ORM Framework. SQL Executor supports raw SQL, automatic SQL generation, lazy loading of data, and binding result sets of POCO or dynamic models. Now, in order to perform retrieve operations to the SQL Executor object, we can use any one of the retrieve methods of the object. The select method returns the entire result set from the raw SQL statement. Here's a small example. The scalar method returns the first column of the first row after executing the raw SQL statement. Here's another example. The select1 method returns the first row after executing raw SQL statements. And another example of this method. Finally, the select lazy method returns data on a per on-demand basis, and one more example of this code too. Now let's take a look at the select lazy method. First, we declare a string variable that will contain the raw SQL statement. Then the current connection needs to be opened. We now execute the SQL statement. It doesn't get the result set eagerly. It is normally used to handle rows that contain columns with large binary values. Then we load each row on demand. And finally, close the current connection. To perform CRUD operations with the SQL Executor, we use the execute method. It is used to execute SQL statements like update, insert, and delete. It returns the number of affected rows if it succeeds. And here's a small code snippet of how to use it. Let's now look at a real example of how to perform an insert. We declare a string variable for the raw SQL. We execute the raw SQL statement, passing in the parameter values it requires. And we can now know how many rows have been affected. This is an example of the update. You'll notice that it is very similar, but this example doesn't pass in any parameters. Of course, you could if you wanted to. Now, an example of a delete. Very similar as well. But what if I wanted to actually select from a stored procedure from the database? Then we can select, or we can use the select procedure method. It returns the result set obtained by executing a SQL stored procedure. Here's a simple code snippet of how to do it. Or we can also execute a stored procedure instead. It returns the number of affected rows if it succeeds. Here's another code snippet. Let's see some code that we'll retrieve using a store procedure. First, we specify the procedure to be executed. This store procedure inserts a customer to the database and returns the newly created ID. We set the parameter values and the parameter direction as input. Then we execute the store procedure. We now get the customer ID from the result. Let's now see how to execute an SP. We specify the name of the store procedure. Then we set the new ID as an output type. We now set the parameter values. Notice these are input. We execute the store procedure and obtain the ID from it. Now please remember that implicit transactions automatically perform the commit and rollback while using the execute or execute procedure methods. But for explicit transactions, they require the commit and rollback to be handled by the developer.